Hello, I'm Jorge Gestoso. On today's show, the fracking industry buying influence in the Congress here in Washington. Our guest, Melanie Sloan, Executive Director of Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington. Melanie Sloan, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
Melanie, you are a nationally recognized expert on congressional ethics, and you were releasing a report, and I quote the name of the report, Natural Cash, How the Fracking Industry Fuels Congress. How worrisome is that report?
Well, it's very worrisome. Fracking is a growing industry in America, and members of Congress have been well paid by the fracking industry to stay quiet about all of the damage that it causes.
We're talking about, what, 200% of increase in the last 8 years?
Right, 231% increase. So as we've seen fracking increase, we've seen this massive increase in the spending on campaign contributions by the fracking industry. And all of that money tends to go into districts where there is fracking. So where members of Congress are located, where there's a lot of fracking, that's where those contributions will come. And that in turn will help keep those members of Congress quiet about the problems when their constituents are calling saying, hey, I'm upset about the fracking. The congressperson will feel perhaps more inclined to work with the fracking industry rather than the consumers.
Dollar-wise, we're talking the 231% is from about how much millions to?
It was about $2.1 million to $6.9 million.
In the rest of the industries, the donations were about 41% in the last sort of 80 years, decade. So it's almost like 5 times more.
Right, it is a significant increase.
Your report mentioned that among the 10 recipients of the fracking industry appears like in the second place, Mitch McConnell, and the amount that he receiving in terms of contribution, we're talking about $384,700. Mitch McConnell, the future Senate Majority Leader, and pretty close behind him, John Boehner, which is the House Speaker, the House of Representatives Speaker, about $314,700. So we're talking key players sort of silencing the effects of the fracking in terms of the damage to the environment.
That's exactly right. By contributing money to those who are positioned in Congress best to consider regulations or to stop regulations from going through, that money is well spent. I mean, for the most part in America, campaign contributions are well spent. If you spend enough money, you get better access, you generally get better laws.
You say, quote, unfortunately money, not careful analysis, shapes the debate in Washington.
Yes. And sadly, that's true on nearly any issue anybody would care about.
Your words, with environmental threats posed by fracking, it is essential that the public understand the monetary influence has on congressional candidates. This is an elegant way to say corruption.
Yes, well, I mean, the money buys influence. I mean, there's just no two ways about it. And while there are laws on our books that say campaign contributions can be bribes, in fact, they're never prosecuted as bribes. So we have a campaign finance system that is, in fact, legalized bribery.
The Republicans are trying to spin the wording and say that there's no problem with that, such contributions because that helps freedom of speech.
Right. They say money equals speech, and so the more money you have, the more speech you have, and therefore the more influence you have. I think that almost every American, however, recognizes that the money is hugely corrupting on our political system because you will see Congress unable to act to keep things like our water clean and our air clean and to promote smart climate legislation. All of these things happen day in, day out because of all the money being spent on Congress.
So there's part of the issue here that is controversy. The U.S. government should put their nose on that contributions?
The U.S. government should definitely have closer scrutiny of campaign contributions. It would be a positive step if the Justice Department would prosecute at times members of Congress who seem to exchange legislative action for campaign contributions like the law allows, but as I said, they don't prosecute that. Instead, they prosecute politicians who take money into their personal pocketbooks, but not into their campaign coffers. But it is mostly about money that goes into the campaign coffers. I mean, our politicians spend a significant portion of every single day raising money, and the people who are most likely to give them money are those who want something.
An article written by your organization mentions that the environmentalists are deeply worried that fracking is damaging to the environment. For example, The carcinogenic chemicals used in the fracking contaminate groundwater, cause earth tremors, and discourage investment in renewable energy sources. We're talking not necessarily that they're just donating money, but they're definitely having a negative effect in the activity that they're doing.
Yes, it has huge impacts. I mean, there are people whose water catches on fire, their tap water that catches on fire. There have been, fracking requires a huge amount of water itself, so it decreases the level of groundwater, and this has been a problem in drier areas where they need that water both for drinking and for crop irrigation. There have also been some issues about the dust that fracking pulls out, causing other kinds of damage to the air and damage to human health. So there are lots and lots of issues around fracking, but we are not seeing regulation of fracking like we should. And I'm not saying that we would need to perhaps eliminate fracking altogether, but smart regulation to make sure that the environment is protected and human health is protected. There's really no reason not to be doing this smarter than we are.
So the first three words of the U.S. Constitution, we the people, those congressmen not necessarily looks like they're representing the interest or the concerns of the health issues that could be involved between the fracking industry and we the people.
What Congress represents is the special interest. So when they say we the people, they mean the special people, the people with the most money.
The 1% people.
The 1% people.
Would you say there is a tendency that has changed in terms of the contributions in the last 2, 3, or more decades?
Yes, the campaign contributions have gone up exponentially as the expense of television advertising has gone up. Politicians feel the need to raise more and more money. And then there was a terrible Supreme Court decision a few years ago called Citizens United that unleashed a torrent of even more money into our system. And we have a system that is simply flooded with special interest money. I mean, billionaires want to buy their own politicians, they want to buy their own candidates for president. And now we see that same level of money that's been spent on presidential politics moving into congressional politics. We just had the most expensive midterm election ever.
There's a report of CBS News. They're quoting this gentleman that is Bill Allison from the Sunlight Foundation. And he said, you can have a fair elections when a lot of the money is hidden because of that law, if you want, and nobody knows who is behind it.
Right. And that, I think, is one of the most troubling things. When we write a report like the fracking report, you can actually track the specific campaign contributions because members of Congress or candidates are required to report campaign contributions they receive. But now we see this system where these anonymous groups with names that just are generic sounding, like Americans for America. And so you have no idea who's really behind a group like that. And it is funded with million-dollar contributions, often from big industry, like the oil and gas industry is probably spending lots of money on ads against politicians who want to regulate things like fracking. And while we, the people, have no idea who's running those ads, and those ads are intended and do in fact influence our votes, you can be sure that the politicians who benefit from those ads, they know who's running the ad because those companies want their pound of flesh later. They're going to come back and say, see, look what I did for you. And at the same time, many other politicians may see those ads and think, wow, I don't want that company to come and do that to me. You know, I don't need to take this hard vote. I can just let this issue go. The
Sunlight Foundation, through Bill Allison, identified $145 million in those, what they call dark monies coming from the midterm elections. And we're talking about between $4 billion and $6 billion spent in that midterm, the highest amount spent ever.
Right.
And also they identified that at least $14 million went to Mitch McConnell's donations.
Right. He had a group that was called something like the Kentucky Opportunity Leadership Committee or something meaningless. And it was funded entirely by dark money.
And he himself said that it's a way to represent or respect free speech and that people should be able to spend as they wish.
Right. Now, McConnell has changed his position over the years, interestingly enough. He, while he's always been this absolutist saying you should be able to spend as much money as you want, he used to also say you needed disclosure so that we, the people, had a right to at least know who was funding all of these campaign ads. And he's changed his tune on that now and no longer believes in any disclosure. And of course, the reason he doesn't believe in that is this secret money is exactly what's helping him become majority leader today.
They call it the Disclosure Act.
Yeah.
and it didn't go further enough, even within the Democrats. And now, with a majority of the Senate in the hands of the Republicans, is absolutely doomed to die.
Well, the majority, the Democrats would have been able to pass it, but they needed 60 votes for cloture, and they didn't. There were not 60 Democrats. So while all the Democrats last Congress did in fact vote for it, since no Republicans did, they didn't reach the 60 vote threshold they would have needed. And besides, they don't have the votes for it in the House of Representatives anyway, because the House Republican conference there is not any more interested in a disclosed bill than the Republicans
and Melanie,
in the Senate.
How do you read that this issue is not coming clearly in the mass media? Why?
You know, I think that a lot of reporters in Washington, for example, just think this is how it is, and this is not really newsworthy. What is so important that we find is to tie the money to issues people care about, to say things like, this is why we do things like the fracking report. So we can say, you're concerned about fracking? Well, let me tell you, the reason fracking exists and isn't being regulated is because of these campaign contributions. The reason your water is catching on fire, or you're worried about your children's ability to breathe the air here, is because of these campaign contributions. And so it's really important to try to tie these concepts together rather than just talk about them abstractly about the problem of money in politics, because then people just throw up their hands and feel like there's nothing they can do.
Is there a way that you could expect that people could react to all that?
I think the best way people could react is if they say, threw all the members of the House out. Let's say, I mean, they're all elected every 2 years. And so the fact is, in a lot of ways, we get the government we deserve. We have an incredibly low voting rate here in the United States. People don't pay attention. They don't really listen to what our politicians are telling us. They don't question politicians when they lie to us. And they don't get out and vote. So if we all got out and voted and said it's really unacceptable that you're letting the special interests make the decisions for you rather than you deciding in your constituents' interest, then politicians would do something different because they all really want to keep their jobs.
We were interviewing Brian Becker, who is the national director of the organization called Answer Coalition, and he said, well, because we were asking, is this democracy? And he said, this is plutocracy. What do you think about it?
I think, sadly, that he's right. I think there are politicians who are deciding every day to vote in the interest of the corporate, their corporate donors and benefactors rather than their constituents. And that is why we see so many laws in so many areas that are troubling, and we can't get action on things that so many people care about.
How difficult is it to fight against all that in case of your organization?
It's hugely difficult because the amount of money that is coalesced on the other side, the special interests who want this system because it works for them, versus the really tiny amount of money that good government groups like mine have to fight the issue, it's a David and Goliath situation. But that doesn't mean it's not worth fighting. I mean, you can't say, well, there's nothing we can do. I think that over the long term, Americans will be fed up. I think there will be a massive fundraising scandal on par with Watergate, and I think that will force change. But I don't think it's going to be tomorrow. I think this is a long-term problem.
You've been you're an attorney?
Yes.
And you've been working in this area for years now.
Right.
Tell me about your experience.
Well, I started my organization, Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, back in 2003. And we've had some really terrific victories. We started so that we could point out the problems with ethics in Congress. We felt like there were a lot of unethical members of Congress who were making decisions on behalf of industry and not on behalf of their constituents. And we've been able to effectively push a lot of those members of Congress to resign, retire, or have them not win re-election. Because when constituents understand how corrupt their members are, they often don't vote for them again. So it's about bringing that message home to people so that they see what their member of Congress is doing. Because, people are busy. They have their lives, their kids, and so it's really hard for them to know what their politicians are doing here in Washington if they live, say, in Ohio. So what we try to do is point out the ethics violations and then tell people in Ohio on the drive time radio where people are in their cars and in their local papers and point out the things that their members of Congress are doing so they can make informed decisions about whether these are the people best suited to represent them.
And you're not in a catch-22 situation because the media that you're trying to reach to pass a message is for some people, part of the problem instead of part of the solution.
In my experience, the media is interested in these kinds of stories. The lack of ethics of Congress, if you can specifically tie money to votes, we find that usually you can get reporters to cover that, because I think reporters by and large find the system to be corrupt and troubling as well.
The action in terms of the media to report has changed or has been steady in terms of the interest of reporters to report on that?
What I would say the big change has been the change in our media environment with the closing of so many newspapers. Because of the increased size of the internet, newspapers have really been struggling, and there are so many fewer investigative reporters than there used to be. We used to see investigative teams at all the major newspapers across the country. Like, for example, one of the best that we used to work with in the early part of the 2000s was the Los Angeles Times, and they don't have investigative reporters anymore who cover money and politics in Congress, and that's really sad. So the role of Watchdogs is even more important now, and the role of nonprofit journalism is also critical, because there has been such a decrease in the number of reporters who are actually investigating this stuff on their own.
There are certain subjects or issues that they receive more quote-unquote donations than others. For example, the war industry.
Right. Sure, the war industry, that's another, the entire defense industry is another sector of massive campaign contributions, and that's been a subject of a lot of corruption. We had spent a lot of time at Crew going after a member of Congress named John Murtha, who was a very influential Democrat until he died a few years ago. And he was the head of defense appropriations, and the amount of money he collected day in and day out in order to earmark awards for big defense contractors was enormous, and this was taxpayer money going out for often military equipment that we just didn't need.
What about the pharmaceutical industry?
Same thing. You will see the pharmaceutical industry also has more lobbyists than there are members of Congress. And they are an incredibly effective lobby, and they also make huge amounts of campaign contributions, and it is largely thanks to their lobbying that prescription drugs in America are so expensive.
We're having an issue here that I have seen in the APEC summit recently in China is the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Pact. Free trade agreements also has a lot of donations to the congressman in order to get approved.
Right. I think what you're seeing here is that there is no issue where there is not a lot of money going in to influence how members of Congress make their decisions. And very frequently, members of Congress make the decisions on behalf of the industries they regulate. We did a report a couple of years ago comparing what committee you sat on with the amount of campaign contributions you got and whether you decided in favor of that industry or against it. And members of Congress very frequently are deciding in favor of the industries they regulate and against the consumer.
In the TPP, we're talking about patents, and the pharmaceutical industries are putting special emphasis to keep patents in, for example, cancer treatments that could enable them to have all the patents for about 12 years and therefore dictate the prices.
Right. Yes, and I think that's a not unusual experience.
Exactly, and that goes supposedly against what is supposed to be free trade or free markets.
Right.
Which is exactly the opposite. If you want to dictate prices, basically you are preaching monopoly.
Right.
And that's what's going on.
These are always closed-door negotiations, backroom deals, and very frequently they just don't benefit most members of the American public, but there are big moneyed interests that can be counted on to make even more money as a result of these decisions. So these are really smart investments by these companies. You have to recognize the amount of money they spend lobbying and the amount of money they spend on campaign contributions. That money is dwarfed by what they win.
We're talking, what, billions of dollars to be made?
Billions of dollars to be made.
Do they hate organizations like yours?
I think some of them hate organizations like mine, and some of them, because of the amount of money at stake, and because many of them get what they want, except in an isolated case. They view us as nothing more than irritating, something they have to deal with, but not something that substantially gets in their way, because the fact of the matter is, most of Congress really is bought and paid for.
And in the case of your organization, who is paying for your organization? Do they have tried to buy influence in your organization?
Interestingly, no. You'd think that might happen, right? Because that would make some sense so that we would be quiet. But that is not the way it works. Our organization is funded by people who are depressed about their government and think that it should be better. Often we have some small donors, people who contribute through the internet, but we also have had some large donors who are just believe that honesty and integrity are the values we want to see all of our politicians portray.
In your particular case, you haven't been threatened or made feel the heat that you better calm down?
You know, that's one of the nice things I think about America versus so many other countries where I would have much more fear of my life, frankly, and in some countries, undoubtedly, I'd be killed. But in America, what people do is character assassination. So people say really terrible things about me a lot, and you have to have a thick skin, but I've never really had any concern for my safety. There was a time many years ago when we were going after the House Majority Leader at the time, Tom DeLay, where there was a private detective hired to look into my background. But I lead a boring life, so they didn't amount to anything.
And why did you do it?
I do it because I really believe that we should have a better government and that America has a lot of promise, but we're not meeting our potential. And it would be terrific if we did.
When we were having that conversation with Brian Becker, he said that Americans are one of the most uninformed people in the world because the mass media could keep things in order to have those congressmen sell their spin about what it is and it's not good for the American people.
You know, I don't think it's that you have to keep anything from the American people. I think, sadly, they're more interested in celebrity news and gossip most of the time than they are in understanding the complicated policies behind, say, the Affordable Care Act. I think that most Americans just aren't that interested in the policies that really affect them from A to Z, and I think that is a sad case. But when you ask me why I do it, I feel like if everybody took the view of it's somebody else's problem, then no one would ever be trying to make it better. And I feel like I have a responsibility, it's my country, to try and improve upon it.
If they're more interested about celebrity news, could be also because I'm exposed much more to that type of information,
right,
than to be doing their homework as a citizen and question what their representatives should be doing.
Right. We don't seem to have a culture of being informed about politics like some other countries do, where just every person on the street will know more about what's going on in their political system. Sadly, our political system has allowed people to tune out for too long. And I think that there is also a great deal of frustration with our system, and a lot of people have just thrown up their hands and said, you know, they're all corrupt, they're all crooks. I mean, Congress has a lower approval rating than cockroaches now. So there is a lot of frustration by the American people, and I think that plays into it. So it would be terrific if we had politicians of great stature really working to advance the interests of all the American people, and hopefully we'll elect some.
And in the case about congressmen legislating about women, which most of them are men, or legislating about foreign policy and they don't even have a passport.
Yeah.
Isn't that sort of an insult?
I think that there are definitely problems with the level of the quality of many of our politicians today. I think that they are often elected to look at small parochial interests, and when you're a member of Congress, you should be well educated and well informed. You're voting on things that affect the entire world. So it would be nice if you learned about those things rather than prided yourself on refusing to learn about them, which is what some of them do. So I think there has been an increase in the small-mindedness of many of our politicians that I think doesn't benefit our country or their constituents.
When you're trying to challenge them, and therefore a report, for example, can end up with the resignation of one of those congressmen, do you think that it sets example for the American public to request or demand more from a congressman?
I think so. I tell people routinely that they should demand more from their members of Congress. They should ask them questions when they go to town halls, and they shouldn't be pawned off with trite answers that are meaningless. It is important to keep yourself informed and understand when your member of Congress isn't giving you a real answer to your question. It is our responsibility, though, as citizens to pay attention, because ultimately we have the power to vote these people out. Sadly, we just don't use it.
Melanie Sloan, thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.